January 17th, 1945. Just before dawn, the air over the Philippine jungle is thick with mist and anticipation. Silence presses against the hills, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant bird and the rustle of palm fronds. Japanese officers peer anxiously from their hastily dug command posts, eyes tracing the faint outlines of terrain they thought secure. Their ears strain for the familiar, for signs of the morning routine, the disciplined march of infantry. Suddenly, a low, grinding roar rises from the darkness. Shadows shift across the jungle floor. The unmistakable silhouettes of the Sherman tanks emerge, their tracks chewing through mud and foliage with relentless precision. Engines hum, guns glint faintly in the pre-dawn gloom. Officers exchange hurried whispers, a cold dread spreading through their ranks. These machines are unlike anything they anticipated. Armored, mobile, unstoppable. Before the first light of day, the balance of fear tilts. A dawn assault no one predicted is about to shatter assumptions and force decisions that will echo across the battlefield. By late 1944, the Pacific War had reached a decisive stage. The Allied forces, advancing steadily through island after island, had begun to edge closer to the Philippines, the strategic archipelago that was both a symbol and a gateway. Control of the Philippines meant control of vital sea lanes and airfields, a crucial foothold for the eventual liberation of Southeast Asia and the approach to Japan itself. American commanders were fully aware of the stakes. Each island captured represented not just a tactical gain, but a psychological blow to the Japanese military, whose defensive doctrine increasingly relied on fortifications, ambushes, and the sheer willpower of determined soldiers. The Japanese defenders, meanwhile, had spent months preparing for the inevitable. Island fortresses were carved into hillsides, artillery positions camouflaged beneath thick foliage, and trenches dug into the rocky soil. Officers relied on experience and doctrine, confident that their intimate knowledge of the terrain, coupled with the natural defensive advantages of the islands, could repel any frontal assault. Yet, even as they planned, there was a growing undercurrent of unease. Supply lines were strained, reinforcements slow to arrive, and intelligence reports hinted at the enemy's use of armored vehicles, something the defenders had little experience confronting. In this theater of war, the Sherman tank represented a seismic shift in capability. Designed for mobility and firepower, the M4 Sherman could traverse jungle trails, shell fortified positions, and sustain fire under conditions that would immobilize lighter vehicles. For the Japanese, accustomed to facing infantry, artillery, and lighter anti-tank weapons, the arrival of these machines was nothing short of terrifying. Intelligence officers noted their specifications: 70 millimeters of frontal armor, 75 millimeters guns capable of piercing even reinforced bunkers, and speed that allowed rapid repositioning across uneven terrain. Every detail that emerged increased the tension in the command posts scattered across the islands. Strategically, the Americans combined the Shermans with infantry, artillery, and air reconnaissance in meticulously coordinated operations. Dawn attacks were a favored tactic. By striking in the early hours, visibility was limited, confusion maximal, and defenders were caught in the delicate transition between night and day. Engineers and scouts would reconnoiter jungle paths in advance, clearing routes and marking weak points, allowing the tanks to navigate terrain the defenders assumed was impassable. The result was a seamless integration of speed, surprise, and firepower, a combination that would leave Japanese officers scrambling to adapt. For the men on the ground, the psychological environment was just as critical as the physical terrain. Japanese officers were trained to maintain discipline under extreme conditions, to instill confidence in their troops even as supply shortages and fatigue mounted. But the very presence of these armored behemoths introduced an unknown variable. Fear is rarely immediate. It is cumulative, a slow burn of realization. Soldiers might steel themselves for mortars, for machine guns, for hand-to-hand combat. But the Sherman was different. Its sheer scale, its armored invincibility, and the inevitability of its advance were impossible to ignore. Rumors began to circulate that entire positions could be obliterated in minutes, that no foxhole or trench could stop its relentless approach. Officers tried to prepare their men mentally, but the tension was tangible, almost physical, in the sweat, the trembling hands, the hushed conversations behind sandbags. At the same time, Japanese intelligence suffered from gaps and miscalculations. Reports often underestimated the number of tanks, misjudged their arrival times, or failed to account for the coordination with infantry and artillery. Communication lines, already compromised by terrain and Allied air superiority, could not reliably update defensive plans. Commanders relied on visual observation and guesswork, noting dust clouds and engine roars in the distance, trying to piece together an emerging picture of an assault that was always one step ahead of them. Meanwhile, American forces moved with purpose. Tanks rumbled through cleared trails, infantry advanced behind them, and artillery observers coordinated strikes with precision. The combination of mechanized power and human determination created an almost inexorable momentum. The Japanese, who had trained for defensive positions, were now facing an enemy capable of bending the terrain itself to its will. The pre-dawn hours amplified the tension. Shadows hid the full scale of the advancing force. The roar of engines masked the exact number of tanks, and the officers had only moments to decide whether to hold their lines or retreat. This convergence of preparation, misjudgment, and mechanical superiority created a crucible of anticipation. The stage was set for the moment when the first Shermans would crest the hills, their engines growling like predators in the darkness. Japanese officers, confident in their strategy, yet anxious about the unknown, braced for impact. Every trench, every gun emplacement, every command post was about to be tested not by ordinary infantry, but by armored steel moving with terrifying inevitability. The morning would arrive not with the predictable rhythm of routine, but with the sudden, shocking presence of machines the defenders had been trained to fear but never fully imagined. And in that moment, the human and mechanical elements of war would collide with consequences that would echo far beyond the jungle trails of the Philippines. As dawn approached, the American plan unfolded with careful precision. Task force units had spent weeks gathering intelligence, mapping trails, and rehearsing maneuvers in conditions that mirrored the Philippine jungles. Sherman tanks were central to this strategy, not simply as weapons, but as mobile engines of shock and surprise. Coordinated with infantry and supported by field artillery, their advance was designed to cut through the defensive positions the Japanese had meticulously constructed. Every commander understood that timing was paramount. Too early, and the defenders might recover. Too late, and the element of surprise would vanish. The Sherman's capabilities were well suited to this challenge. Lightweight enough to navigate narrow jungle paths, yet heavily armored against small arms, it carried a 75mm main gun capable of destroying fortified positions from hundreds of meters. Its speed, nearly 25 miles per hour on rough terrain, allowed it to overrun defensive positions before defenders could adjust. Smoke projectors, mounted on several tanks, added to the disorientation, blanketing Japanese lines in gray fog and obscuring the approaching mechanized threat. Engineers had cleared paths where natural obstacles once blocked vehicles, and reconnaissance teams had identified the weak points in defensive trenches and pillboxes. On the Japanese side, the officers faced an increasingly tense calculus. Their training emphasized adaptability and strict command discipline, yet uncertainty gnawed at their decisions. Signals intelligence suggested armored units were on the move, but reports were fragmented, often hours behind real-time movements. The men in the trenches had grown accustomed to defending against infantry assaults and artillery bombardments, but the prospect of tanks arriving before dawn introduced an entirely new dimension. Orders were given to prepare anti-tank weapons, but shortages, and were meant few, could reliably penetrate Sherman armor. Mortars and machine guns, once sufficient to control approaches, now seemed almost irrelevant. The psychological strain on officers was palpable. They were responsible for hundreds of lives and for a defensive line that could crumble in minutes. Human factors played a critical role in shaping the battle even before the first shells were fired. Japanese soldiers, exhausted from weeks of constant vigilance and supply shortages, relied heavily on the confidence projected by their officers. As pre-dawn mist clung to the earth, whispers of the approaching armored threat circulated, and fear began to seep into the ranks. Officers attempted to maintain composure, issuing calm instructions, but the subtle tremor in their voices betrayed unease. Conversely, American crews were fueled by determination, knowing the effectiveness of their machines and trusting in the precision of their planning. The contrast between the disciplined, confident attackers and the tense, anxious defenders created an invisible pressure that would shape the engagement from the first moment of contact. The American commanders understood that dawn offered both opportunity and risk. Limited visibility could conceal their movement, allowing them to strike with maximum surprise, yet it also meant navigating treacherous terrain with little margin for error. Tank commanders relied on detailed reconnaissance reports, maps marked with the positions of enemy emplacements, and constant radio communication to maintain formation and avoid ambush. Infantry units moved closely behind, ready to exploit breaches and provide security against counterattacks. Artillery observers, stationed on nearby ridges, prepared to deliver supporting fire with pinpoint accuracy. The synchronization of these elements was essential. Any misstep could compromise the entire assault. Meanwhile, Japanese officers attempted to fortify what could be held, repositioning limited anti-tank weapons and shoring up trenches. Communication lines between units were chaotic, and the uncertainty of the enemy's strength added to the stress. Reports of distant engine roars filtered through the jungle canopy, yet their source remained obscured by mist and darkness. Officers had to balance caution with decisiveness, weighing the risk of retreat against the expectation of heroic resistance ingrained by doctrine. Every decision carried immediate consequences. The convergence of these factors, American planning, mechanized power, Japanese defensive strategy, and human emotion, created a charged environment, thick with anticipation. By the first faint light of day, the stage was perfectly set. The Japanese officers, confident in their knowledge of terrain and fortifications, were about to confront an enemy that moved differently, struck differently, and instilled fear in ways they had never experienced. Every trench, every command post, every observation point would be tested against the armored advance. And as the mist began to thin, revealing the first glimmers of movement in the distance, the Japanese officers could only watch. The Shermans were not just approaching. They were arriving with the inevitability of a storm. The battlefield, once familiar, was about to be transformed in a matter of minutes. The anticipation of that moment, the uncertainty and dread, set the perfect stage for the multiple angles through which the assault would be understood: human, tactical, technological, and psychological. The human element of warfare often dictates its course long before the first bullet is fired. On the Philippine Islands, the Japanese officers had trained their men to hold every ridge, every trench, every fortification with unyielding resolve. Their doctrine emphasized courage, discipline, and the sanctity of defensive positions, instilling a belief that terrain could be made to fight for them. Yet in the moments before the Sherman tanks appeared, these principles were tested against an unfamiliar and terrifying force. Officers watched from observation posts as shadows shifted unnaturally across the jungle floor. The engine's low rumble, initially distant, grew steadily into a mechanical growl that resonated through the earth, vibrating the very nerves of men long accustomed to the rhythm of infantry assaults. Fear in this context was not sudden, it was cumulative. Rumors filtered through the ranks. The Americans had brought new weapons, machines capable of tearing through bunkers that had seemed impregnable. Soldiers gripped rifles tighter, eyes darting toward the mist where the first shapes of tanks would inevitably appear. Officers attempted to maintain composure, masking their anxiety with clipped commands and gestures, yet the stress was palpable. One officer, his hand trembling as he traced defensive positions on a map, whispered about the tank's armor and firepower, questions with no immediate answers. Morale, the invisible backbone of any military unit, teetered on the edge. The human angle of this encounter was simple yet profound. Courage is tested not by what you anticipate, but by what you cannot control. Tactically, the arrival of Shermans represented a disruption of the Japanese defensive paradigm. For months, commanders had studied maps, reinforced trenches, and positioned artillery to maximize their defensive advantage. They expected infantry attacks, perhaps artillery barges, but armored columns moving swiftly through jungle trails were outside their calculations. The Americans had devised a plan that exploited these assumptions. Reconnaissance teams had identified weak points along the Japanese lines. Narrow trails that were too rugged for foot soldiers to patrol effectively, positions where artillery coverage was limited, and choke points that, once breached, would leave entire sectors exposed. Sherman tanks, advancing with infantry support, were able to exploit each of these vulnerabilities. The integration of infantry and armor created a combined arms effect that overwhelmed traditional defenses. Tanks would roll ahead, absorbing or deflecting fire, while infantry followed to secure flanks and eliminate remaining resistance. Artillery and mortars, coordinated by forward observers, pounded fortified positions just beyond the line of sight. The result was not simply destruction, it was psychological paralysis. The defenders could not predict where the next strike would come from, nor could they gauge the number of tanks moving through the undergrowth. A single Sherman crossing a hill could appear as a dozen in the shadowed mist, exaggerating the perceived threat. The tactical angle was clear. Surprise, speed, and coordination amplified the raw power of the machines in a way that human calculation alone could not counter. Technology, as always, was both a sword and a shield. The Sherman specifications gave it a decisive advantage. Its 75mm gun could penetrate bunkers and light fortifications. Its armor resisted Japanese anti-tank rifles and artillery at ranges most infantry could manage. Mobility allowed it to navigate narrow trails and cross obstacles that the Japanese assumed were impassable. Smoke projectors and machine guns augmented its offensive capabilities, turning it into a mobile fortress capable of both attack and defense. The psychological impact of technology on the battlefield cannot be overstated. The Japanese soldiers, trained to respect firepower but unfamiliar with mechanized armor at this scale, faced a tangible embodiment of inevitability. Every rattling tread, every metallic clank, was a statement. The battlefield had changed, and the rules of engagement were no longer theirs to define. Even within the Japanese command posts, technology shaped decisions. Officers struggled to adapt their strategies to account for the armored threat. Maps and reports were reviewed repeatedly, but the margin for error was slim. Every defensive line could be breached in minutes. Every fortification might be rendered obsolete by a tank's main gun. Communication difficulties compounded the problem. Lines were frequently cut by advancing forces, and signals often lagged behind reality. Decisions had to be made in real time, without complete information, while men in the field were already reacting to the initial shock. The clash of human judgment and mechanical certainty created a tension that pervaded the battlefield, a silent duel between experience and innovation. At the same time, American crews approached the battle with confidence born of preparation. Tank commanders understood the terrain, had memorized trails, and knew the exact placement of Japanese fortifications. Infantrymen were briefed to support armor, clear obstacles, and exploit breaches. Artillery observers calculated trajectories with precision. The human and technological components operated in perfect synergy, a product of planning, training, and coordination. In the misty pre-dawn light, the combined effect was overwhelming. An unstoppable force meeting a force that had prepared for everything but this. The human, tactical, and technological angles intersected in a single point of tension. The Japanese officers were responsible for men whose lives depended on their decisions. They faced an enemy whose machines rendered traditional tactics partially irrelevant. The Americans, meanwhile, relied on the precise execution of doctrine, the mechanical superiority of their Shermans, and the discipline of their soldiers. This collision of anticipation, fear, and mechanized might created a battlefield charged with anxiety, anticipation, and impending chaos. By the time the first silhouettes of the Sherman tanks appeared through the mist, the human psyche, defensive calculations, and technological capabilities were already in motion, converging toward a single moment. The moment when shock would ripple through the Japanese lines, and the battlefield would be irreversibly transformed. The stage was set for the second set of angles, which would examine leadership, enemy perspective, and the psychological collapse induced by the armored dawn assault. Leadership is tested most when the unexpected arrives. On the Philippine Islands, Japanese officers faced a dilemma that no amount of training could fully prepare them for. The Shermans had appeared before dawn, their presence defying both expectation and doctrine. Commanders tried to impose order on chaos, issuing instructions for repositioning anti-tank weapons, coordinating small unit counterattacks, and maintaining communication between widely separated defensive positions. Yet with the low hum of tank engines vibrating through the soil, every decision carried amplified weight. Retreat could mean surrendering strategic ground. A stubborn hold could result in annihilation. The psychological burden of command intensified as reports filtered in. Trenches overrun, machine gun nests destroyed, entire squads immobilized. Officers were forced to make rapid, imperfect choices, balancing doctrine, intuition, and the grim reality of mechanized assault. From the enemy perspective, the sudden arrival of Shermans was disorienting, almost surreal. Japanese defenders were trained to anticipate infantry assaults, shelling, and ambushes. Yet these tanks moved with an unnatural inevitability. The mist of pre-dawn obscured their numbers and trajectories, creating a sense of omnipresence. Soldiers could hear engines, but could not see how many armored vehicles were advancing. Shadows shifted and multiplied, amplifying fear. Reports of heavy losses from minor contacts spread quickly, as soldiers interpreted isolated incidents as indicators of overwhelming force. Each encounter reinforced the perception that the defensive positions, once assumed secure, were now fragile. From a purely operational standpoint, the defenders were facing a logistical and tactical nightmare. Coordinating small units against a mobile, well-protected, and heavily armed mechanized force was nearly impossible under these conditions. Psychologically, the impact of the pre-dawn assault was profound. Fear became contagious. Officers' attempts to maintain calm were undermined by the mounting evidence of destruction unfolding before their eyes. Soldiers frozen in trenches or behind pillboxes felt a combination of awe and terror as tanks crushed obstacles, obliterated positions, and advanced with relentless momentum. The moral effect of this display was amplified by timing. Before dawn, when visibility was limited and uncertainty was highest, The human brain instinctively overestimates threats. The Shermans became symbols of inevitability rather than mere machines of war. Japanese soldiers experienced what historians have termed anticipatory terror, the dread of a threat that seems larger, faster, and more unstoppable than it actually is, intensified by the environment and the element of surprise. Leadership, perspective, and psychology converged in ways that reshaped the battlefield before full engagement. Officers attempted to marshal reserves, but communication was sporadic. Orders arrived late or not at all. Decision-making became fragmented. The psychological weight of responsibility, combined with the visible power of the armored advance, created hesitation at every level. Soldiers hesitated to fire, fearing retaliation or knowing their weapons could not penetrate armor. Officers hesitated to commit units, knowing the wrong move could cascade into a wider collapse. Every misstep, every delay, magnified the shock effect initiated by the Sherman's arrival. This terror was not abstract. It had measurable consequences. Japanese defensive doctrine relied heavily on coordinated, disciplined resistance. Once fear disrupted that coordination, the ability to mount effective counterattacks diminished sharply. Units became isolated, their morale eroded by uncertainty and the realization that their positions could not withstand prolonged mechanized assault. Even small breaches, initial Shermans entering a trench line or knocking out a pillbox, triggered ripple effects, causing panic and disorder in adjacent sectors. Leadership struggled to reassert control, but the combination of pre-dawn darkness, unfamiliar machinery, and mounting casualties made it nearly impossible. American leadership, by contrast, was focused on exploiting these psychological and tactical fractures. Commanders had trained for the inevitability of hesitation among defenders and used that knowledge to synchronize armor, infantry, and artillery. Every advance was calculated to maximize confusion and maintain momentum. Forward observers and tank commanders communicated constantly, adjusting fire and movement in response to enemy reactions. The psychological pressure created by the Shermans was therefore both a byproduct of technology and a deliberately integrated component of U.S. strategy. While Japanese officers were burdened by fear and uncertainty, American leaders leveraged the same environment to increase operational efficiency. Moral and human dimensions also shaped the engagement. For Japanese soldiers, fear was compounded by the sense of betrayal of their own assumptions about warfare. They had trained to believe that fortifications, terrain, and courage could hold the line. Those beliefs were now undercut by machines that moved too fast, fired too accurately, and seemed immune to conventional attacks. The human cost of this realization, both the immediate casualties and the erosion of confidence, was immense. Officers who had spent months building morale watched it unravel in minutes, their authority undermined by circumstances beyond their control. For American crews, there was a dual awareness. They faced danger, but they also recognized the psychological leverage their machines provided. The Shermans were not only weapons. They were instruments of intimidation, capable of reshaping the battlefield without firing a single shot. By examining leadership, enemy perspective, and psychological impact, the complexity of the pre-dawn armored assault comes into focus. It was not merely an encounter between forces. It was a collision of human expectation, technological power, and strategic foresight. Officers and soldiers alike were forced to confront realities that challenged both training and instinct. The battlefield had shifted from a measure of courage and discipline to a test of adaptability, decisiveness, and the ability to respond to fear itself. As the sun began to rise, filtering weak light through the mist, these angles, the strain of command, the disorientation of the enemy, and the moral weight of fear, set the stage for the ultimate confrontation. The Shermans were not just approaching, they were about to strike. And in that moment, all the preparation all the calculation and all the tension built over months would find its decisive expression. The human, tactical, technological, and psychological forces converged, leading inevitably to the climactic breaking point of the battle. The first light of January 17th, 1945, had not yet pierced the dense jungle canopy. Mist clung to every leaf, every fold of the terrain, hiding movement and amplifying sound. From their concealed positions, Japanese officers scanned the shadows, their nerves taut, ears straining for any indication of the approaching threat. Then it came, the low, grinding roar of engines that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. At first, it was distant, almost imperceptible, but it grew with every heartbeat, swelling into a mechanical crescendo that reverberated through the soil, rattling even the sturdiest trenches. The first Shermans appeared through the mist like predators emerging from shadowed forest. Their silhouettes were enormous against the low, gray light, armored hulls glinting faintly, turrets scanning, guns poised. The roar of their engines drowned out the jungle entirely, masking the approach of accompanying infantry and artillery units. Officers in the Japanese command posts felt the tension spike. Whispers of disbelief ran through the ranks. "It can't be this many," one muttered, tracing a trembling finger along a map. Another barked orders to reposition anti-tank teams, but the sound of metal scraping mud and the rhythmic crunch of tank treads made the instructions almost irrelevant. Then the first shots were fired. A 75mm round slammed into a pillbox, tearing through reinforced walls and sending plumes of smoke and debris skyward. The shockwave rattled nearby trenches, knocking soldiers off their feet. Panic spread immediately. Some units tried to fire back, only to discover that their weapons, rifles, light machine guns, even mortars, were largely ineffective against the approaching armored column. The disparity between expectation and reality became terrifyingly clear. In the chaos, officers ran from post to post, attempting to coordinate resistance, but each position they tried to reach was already under threat or destroyed. The Japanese defensive lines, meticulously planned over months, began to fracture. Trenches that had once seemed secure were now crisscrossed with the tracks of advancing Shermans, each vehicle cutting a path through barbed wire, foliage, and obstacles. Machine gun nests were silenced almost instantly, either obliterated by direct fire or abandoned as crews fled. Artillery positions attempted to respond, but the tanks' mobility allowed them to avoid most of the incoming rounds. Smoke from detonated positions and fire from burning bunkers created a thick haze, further disorienting defenders and masking the true scale of the attack. Human fear became as lethal as the weaponry. Soldiers, trained for courage and resilience, froze under the relentless advance. Some fired blindly into the mist, hoping to hit a target they could not see. Others retreated, abandoning their positions, leaving gaps that the Americans exploited with precision. Officers shouted instructions, but the combination of limited visibility, constant movement, and psychological strain rendered their commands almost irrelevant. Every attempt to re-establish a line was met with another round of explosions, another Sherman cresting a hill, another infantry squad exploiting a breach. American crews, by contrast, moved with disciplined efficiency. Tank commanders coordinated via radio, directing units to suppress strong points while advancing in staggered formations to minimize exposure. Infantry followed closely, clearing trenches and securing flanks. Forward artillery observers called in strikes on positions just behind enemy lines, preventing Japanese units from reorganizing. The integration of armor, infantry, and artillery produced an unstoppable momentum, one that Japanese commanders had anticipated in theory but never imagined in practice. The psychological impact intensified as more Shermans appeared over successive ridges. From the perspective of Japanese officers, the jungle seemed alive with armored behemoths, each one capable of destroying multiple defensive positions. Reports of fallen comrades, obliterated bunkers, and collapsing trenches compounded the fear, creating what historians later described as anticipatory panic. The mind exaggerates threats in such moments. A single tank becomes 10. A trench line's collapse signals an imminent rout. Decisions that required clarity were clouded by adrenaline and terror. Despite the chaos, some pockets of resistance fought with desperate resolve. Officers rallied isolated units, directing concentrated fire on individual Shermans. A few tanks were temporarily disabled by clever use of terrain or anti-tank weapons, offering brief moments of hope. Yet these actions were isolated and fleeting. The combined effect of pre-dawn surprise, armored superiority, and relentless momentum ensured that every defensive success was temporary. The battlefield had shifted irreversibly. By mid-morning, the initial phase of the assault had achieved its decisive effect. Japanese command posts lay in ruin, trenches were overrun, and organized resistance had begun to collapse. Survivors reported the terror and confusion with the same words repeated in multiple units. Invisible, unstoppable, like the earth itself moved against us. Officers, once confident in their positions, were reduced to improvising defensive measures, attempting to slow a force they could neither predict nor fully confront. At the same time, American leadership capitalized on every opportunity. Tanks that breached the first line pressed forward, infantry secured captured ground, and artillery eliminated pockets of resistance. The pre-dawn timing had magnified the psychological and tactical advantage. By the time the sun began to rise, revealing the full scope of the battlefield, the Shermans had established dominance over the terrain. What had begun as an assault was already shaping into a rout, with Japanese forces disoriented, demoralized, and struggling to respond. The initial shock of the Sherman arrival was more than mechanical. It was transformational. Human fear, combined with the technological superiority of the tanks and the tactical acumen of their commanders, had shattered preconceptions. Officers who had trained for months to defend their positions found their doctrine insufficient. Every decision carried life or death consequences. Every hesitation magnified the effect of armored dominance. The jungle, once thought to favor the defender, had become a proving ground for mechanized warfare, and the first light of day revealed the irreversible consequences of the pre-dawn strike. The battlefield had changed fundamentally and irreversibly. The next phase of the engagement, Sherman's exploiting breaches, Japanese forces attempting desperate counterattacks, and commanders making split-second choices, was already approaching. The first phase of shock had set the stage, leaving fear, confusion, and destruction as the dominant realities. The final moments of organized resistance would soon unfold, but the momentum belonged entirely to the approaching armored force. By mid-morning, the battlefield had become unrecognizable. Trenches that once defined Japanese defensive lines were now shattered corridors of mud and debris. Pillboxes that had been expected to hold firm against infantry and artillery had been reduced to smoldering ruins. Smoke drifted across the landscape, curling around shattered trees and half-collapsed fortifications. The Shermans moved through it all with relentless efficiency, their engines roaring, their guns trained on every potential threat. The Japanese officers, already strained to their limits, faced a grim reality. The battle was no longer a contest of skill or courage. It was a struggle to survive. Attempts at organized counterattack were sporadic and largely ineffective. Small squads tried to ambush advancing tanks, firing anti-tank rifles and grenades, but the armor of the Shermans shrugged off most attacks. Those that landed caused damage only temporarily, and every delay in response was immediately exploited. Officers shouted orders to rally retreating units, but coordination had collapsed. Communication lines, disrupted by the chaos of shelling and smoke, transmitted only fragments of reports. Commanders made split-second decisions, often without knowing the exact positions of their own men. The pre-dawn shock had become a cascade. Each success of the Americans magnified fear, confusion, and disarray among the defenders. The retreat began not as a coordinated withdrawal, but as a series of improvisations. Some units fell back along jungle trails, hoping to regroup at secondary positions. Others scattered entirely, leaving weapons, ammunition, and supplies behind. Officers attempted to form defensive pockets to slow the advance, but every Sherman that crested a ridge or emerged from the mist shattered these efforts. The psychological weight of facing armored machines that could crush fortifications and mow down infantry compounded the physical challenge. Soldiers were no longer just fighting. They were fleeing from an unstoppable presence. American leadership exploited every opening with precision. Tank commanders identified breached sectors and pressed forward, bypassing isolated resistance and linking up with infantry units to secure captured ground. Artillery observers called in fire on remaining defensive positions, eliminating pockets of resistance before they could reorganize. Forward scouts reported weak points in Japanese formations, allowing Shermans to maneuver around natural obstacles and maintain momentum. Every movement was calculated to prevent the defenders from regaining composure, ensuring that fear translated into practical advantage on the battlefield. Amid the chaos, some Japanese officers displayed extraordinary composure. A few rallied scattered troops, using the terrain to establish temporary defensive positions or coordinate counterfire. They organized small teams to ambush tanks from concealed positions or to slow the advance with improvised explosive charges. For brief moments, these acts of leadership produced localized resistance, forcing Shermans to halt or maneuver. Yet these instances were fleeting, overwhelmed by the larger pattern of destruction. The armored advance, combined with infantry support and artillery, maintained unstoppable momentum. The psychological advantage, established in the pre-dawn hours, now dictated the physical outcome. By late morning, the collapse was nearly complete. Entire regiments had either been destroyed, captured, or forced into chaotic retreat. Supply depots were abandoned, command posts reduced to rubble. Reports from surviving officers detailed a landscape dominated by American tanks, advancing through jungle trails once thought secure. The Japanese defensive network, painstakingly built over months, had been fragmented in hours. Even those soldiers who survived the initial assault faced exhaustion, disorientation, and the overwhelming certainty that their positions were lost. Casualties were staggering. The Sherman's coordinated attack had neutralized key defensive points before Japanese troops could organize effective countermeasures. Estimates from after-action reports indicate that the defenders suffered both heavy personnel losses and the loss of critical equipment, while American forces sustained comparatively minimal casualties. The combination of speed, firepower, and tactical innovation had produced a lopsided result. It was not simply victory. It was decisive domination, the kind that reshapes entire theaters of war. The moral impact was equally profound. Japanese officers, once confident in their fortifications and strategy, now faced the terrifying realization that technological superiority, when combined with coordinated leadership, could render doctrine and terrain almost irrelevant. Soldiers who had trained for months to hold every position were forced to reconcile courage with the inevitability of defeat. The psychological scars of this engagement would linger long after the battlefield was cleared, shaping perceptions of armored warfare and the futility of resisting such overwhelming force without equivalent mechanized capabilities. For the Americans, the assault validated months of planning, reconnaissance, and coordination. Tank commanders, infantry leaders, and artillery officers all witnessed the power of combined arms executed with precision. The Shermans had not only broken the enemy line, they had shattered morale, eliminated command cohesion, and demonstrated that armored warfare in jungle terrain could succeed when meticulously planned. This moment would inform future operations, establishing principles of pre-dawn assault, mobility exploitation, and psychological dominance that became integral to Allied campaigns in the Pacific. By the time the sun rose fully, the battlefield was dominated entirely by American forces. The Japanese defensive network lay in ruins, survivors were scattered, and the Shermans, having carved paths through the chaos, stood as symbols of mechanized power and tactical ingenuity. Officers who had once believed in the security of their positions were now forced into reactive improvisation. Their confidence eroded, their control over the battlefield effectively eliminated. The momentum belonged to the armored force, and the consequences of that momentum would reverberate through the following days and campaigns. The first pre-dawn assault had done more than secure terrain. It had rewritten expectations. The Japanese had underestimated the speed, firepower, and coordination of mechanized units. They had faced a dawn attack that combined human precision, technological might, and psychological impact. Every decision, every hesitation, every miscalculation had compounded into an irreversible cascade. And in the wake of the Sherman's advance, one fact was undeniable. The battlefield had changed forever. The stage was now set for the aftermath, where the consequences, strategic, psychological, and human, would be assessed, and the full impact of the armored pre-dawn assault would be understood. By midday, the battlefield lay in an eerie silence, punctuated only by the distant crackle of fires and the groan of injured men. Trenches had been flattened, fortifications obliterated, and trees that once offered concealment now stood splintered or burned to cinders. Smoke drifted across the terrain, mingling with the mist that had yet to fully dissipate, leaving a haunting gray shroud over the devastated positions. The Shermans, having completed their pre-dawn advance, now rested among the wreckage of enemy defenses, their crews inspecting damage and resupplying, but always alert, aware that scattered pockets of resistance could still emerge from the jungle. For the Japanese defenders, the scene was catastrophic. Units that had been positioned to repel any frontal assault had been broken in mere hours. Officers struggled to account for survivors, assess losses, and organize any semblance of a defensive line. Entire regiments had been scattered. Ammunition depots were abandoned, artillery pieces destroyed or captured. Soldiers reported panic, disorientation, and exhaustion, having witnessed the near invincibility of the Sherman tanks and the relentless efficiency of American infantry and artillery coordination. The psychological toll was immense. The notion that their positions could be held by courage and training alone had been shattered. For those officers who survived the initial shock, the challenge now was survival, reassembling units, covering retreats, and preventing total rout. Casualty reports began to arrive, piecing together the human cost of the assault. Estimates indicate that Japanese casualties were extremely high in both personnel and equipment. Entire defensive sectors were neutralized, with soldiers killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Many who survived did so only by abandoning positions and retreating into secondary lines deep within the jungle. Medical officers reported overwhelming numbers of injuries, many sustained from direct tank fire or collapsing fortifications. On the American side, while losses were comparatively lower, crews endured sporadic counterattacks, sniper fire, and difficult terrain, yet the meticulous planning, training, and coordination minimized casualties, preserving the offensive momentum. The battlefield conditions themselves added another layer of complexity to the aftermath. The jungle floor, churned by the treads of Shermans, had become a maze of mud, debris, and wreckage. Burned-out pillboxes and collapsed trenches created obstacles for both sides, hindering movement and complicating medical evacuation for the wounded. Smoke from fires and detonation of ammunition obscured visibility, forcing crews and advancing infantry to navigate with caution. Supply lines had to be re-established rapidly to maintain momentum, and engineers were tasked with clearing paths for the tanks to continue their advance. The environment, once thought to favor the defenders with concealment and fortified positions, now amplified the effectiveness of the pre-dawn assault and the dominance of mechanized units. Reports from surviving Japanese officers painted a grim picture of the morale impact. Many recounted moments of disbelief as Shermans appeared over ridges and rolled through lines previously thought secure. The suddenness and scale of the assault, coupled with the inefficacy of standard anti-tank measures, had eroded confidence at every level. Soldiers, trained to respect hierarchy and obey orders, were caught in a situation where survival instincts overrode discipline. Command cohesion disintegrated in pockets, leaving isolated units to fend for themselves or retreat blindly. This psychological collapse compounded physical losses, making the battlefield easier for American forces to control even after the initial engagement. For American commanders, the aftermath provided an opportunity for assessment and adjustment. Tank crews documented the performance of Shermans in jungle terrain, noting both successes and challenges. Infantry leaders reported on the coordination between units, identifying areas where timing or communication could be improved for future operations. Artillery observers filed detailed accounts of effectiveness, highlighting the importance of pre-dawn targeting and integration with mechanized forces. This thorough analysis ensured that lessons learned from this engagement would inform subsequent campaigns, maximizing the strategic and tactical value of armored assaults in similar environments. The capture and destruction of Japanese positions also yielded intelligence advantages. Maps, communication equipment, and documents recovered from command posts provided insights into enemy strategy, unit organization, and fortification methods. Interrogation of prisoners revealed further details about morale, expectations, and defensive doctrine, confirming the psychological impact that pre-dawn Sherman assaults had on officers and soldiers alike. This intelligence, combined with the physical control of terrain, created conditions for sustained operational momentum, allowing American forces to continue pressing forward while Japanese units struggled to regroup. In addition to strategic and tactical consequences, the immediate human experience left a lasting imprint. Survivors recounted the terror of seeing armored vehicles move seemingly without limit, the deafening roar of engines and gunfire, and the destruction of positions they had believed secure. Officers who had once relied on doctrine and experience now faced the stark realization that technology, timing, and coordination could render months of preparation ineffective. This emotional and psychological aftermath would resonate throughout the Japanese command, influencing subsequent defensive planning and altering the perception of Allied armor capabilities. As the day progressed, the battlefield shifted from active combat to consolidation and recovery. American units secured captured ground, treated the wounded, and assessed the destruction left behind. Japanese survivors moved toward secondary positions or retreated deeper into the jungle, carrying with them the memory of a devastating pre-dawn assault. The landscape bore the scars of mechanized warfare, and the human cost was etched into the faces and actions of both victors and vanquished. By evening, the immediate consequences of the pre-dawn Sherman assault were clear. The Japanese had lost control of key positions, suffered catastrophic casualties, and experienced a psychological shock that would affect subsequent defensive operations. American forces had not only secured territory, but also demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms, mechanized mobility, and tactical innovation. The first phase of aftermath was complete, yet the broader strategic, moral, and long-term consequences were only beginning to emerge. The battlefield, scarred and smoldering, now awaited further analysis. How this engagement would influence future operations, morale, and the overall campaign remained to be seen, setting the stage for the second section of Aftermath, where the long-term strategic, psychological, and operational implications would be explored in depth. In the days following the pre-dawn assault, the true scale of the engagement became increasingly clear. Japanese forces, reeling from the loss of key positions and shattered defensive lines, struggled to reorganize. Command cohesion, already fragmented during the initial attack, remained tenuous. Communication between units was inconsistent. Orders issued from surviving officers were frequently delayed or misinterpreted. The psychological shock of the Sherman advance lingered like a shadow over the remaining troops. Morale, already strained by months of sustained combat and supply shortages, deteriorated further as news spread of the overwhelming power of American armor. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of tanks that seemed unstoppable, of positions that had fallen in minutes, and of the helplessness that accompanies facing an enemy whose capabilities surpass expectation. Strategically, the implications of the assault were profound. The fall of fortified positions opened avenues for further American advances across the islands. The momentum gained by the Shermans allowed infantry to consolidate control, secure supply lines, and push deeper into Japanese-held territory. This created a domino effect. Isolated pockets of resistance were forced into retreat, secondary defensive positions were compromised, and the overall integrity of the Japanese defensive network eroded rapidly. The pre-dawn assault had not only inflicted immediate losses, but had reshaped the operational landscape, enabling the Allies to exploit vulnerabilities that might have otherwise remained hidden for weeks. The psychological dimension of the aftermath extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Officers who had witnessed the assault firsthand were acutely aware of the limitations of their doctrine and equipment. Traditional strategies based on infantry, artillery, and entrenched positions proved insufficient against coordinated mechanized attacks. Letters and reports from the surviving officers, preserved in post-war archives, recount the pervasive fear that had gripped their units. A recognition that bravery and discipline alone could no longer guarantee survival against armored forces. The pre-dawn timing amplified this effect, embedding a sense of inevitability that would haunt planning for subsequent engagements. For the American forces, the aftermath was both operational and instructive. Tank crews and infantry units meticulously documented the success of their maneuvers, analyzing the interplay between armor, infantry, artillery, and terrain. Lessons learned from the engagement, such as the importance of pre-dawn timing, exploitation of natural obstacles, and rapid exploitation of breaches, were incorporated into future operations. Commanders understood that success in jungle warfare depended not solely on firepower, but on precise coordination and psychological leverage. The Shermans' performance validated both the doctrine of combined arms and the tactical principle of surprise, setting benchmarks for armored operations throughout the remainder of the campaign. The impact on Japanese defensive philosophy was immediate and profound. Commanders were forced to confront a new reality. Fortifications alone could not halt mechanized assaults, and reliance on rigid doctrine left units vulnerable to rapid, coordinated attacks. Surviving officers scrambled to adjust, improvising new strategies that emphasized dispersion, concealment, and guerrilla-style tactics. However, the morale effect of the pre-dawn Sherman assault could not be undone. Fear, once instilled, persisted. Soldiers who survived the initial destruction carried a psychological imprint into subsequent engagements, influencing their reactions, decisions, and willingness to hold positions under threat. This psychological edge, achieved through both technology and timing, became a force multiplier for American operations in the Pacific. The material consequences of the engagement were equally significant. Japanese positions were abandoned, equipment destroyed or captured, and supply lines disrupted. Reports indicate that artillery pieces, machine guns, and munitions depots fell into American hands, further tilting the operational balance. Even the landscape itself was altered. Jungle trails churned to mud by tank treads, trees reduced to splintered debris, and fortifications reduced to rubble. These changes were not merely cosmetic. They shaped the terrain for future operations, facilitating subsequent advances while complicating attempts at Japanese countermeasures. Beyond the immediate theater, the pre-dawn assault had broader implications for Pacific warfare. It demonstrated unequivocally that armored units could operate effectively in jungle and island environments, provided they were integrated with infantry and artillery and employed with tactical ingenuity. The success of the Shermans challenged long-standing assumptions about the limitations of mechanized warfare in tropical terrain and influenced Allied planning for subsequent campaigns in the Philippines, Borneo, and Okinawa. Military theorists and post-war analyses frequently cited this engagement as a turning point in the conceptualization of jungle armor tactics, validating principles that would inform both doctrine and training for decades. The human toll of the engagement, however, remained the most enduring aspect of the aftermath. Japanese officers and soldiers confronted the limits of endurance, courage, and cohesion. Survivors recounted vivid images of their comrades falling beneath shells or armored treads, of entire lines collapsing in minutes, and of the disorienting, terrifying roar of pre-dawn engines. These recollections underscore a fundamental truth of warfare. Technological superiority magnifies psychological effects, and fear can be as decisive as firepower in determining outcomes. Conversely, American soldiers carried with them the knowledge that preparation, coordination, and effective use of machinery could overcome entrenched positions and an enemy prepared for conventional defense. As the dust settled and fires burned out, both sides began to reckon with the consequences. Japanese forces faced the daunting task of regrouping under harrowing conditions, adjusting strategy, and coping with diminished morale. American units consolidated their gains, reinforced supply lines, and prepared for the next phase of the campaign. The pre-dawn Sherman assault had not only achieved tactical victory, but had established a new paradigm for engagement. Speed, surprise, technology, and psychological leverage combined to dominate terrain and enemy alike. By the evening of January 17th, the battlefield had been irreversibly transformed. The immediate physical devastation was matched by profound shifts in morale, strategy, and perception. Japanese defenders had learned, in the harshest terms, that armored might could overwhelm even the most carefully constructed fortifications, and that fear, when harnessed by a well-coordinated enemy, could amplify destruction beyond the capacity of conventional defenses. For American forces, the victory provided validation of planning, coordination, and tactical innovation. The pre-dawn assault had reshaped not only this battlefield, but the approach to future operations, setting in motion strategic and psychological consequences that would ripple through the remainder of the Pacific campaign. The pre-dawn assault of January 17, 1945, marked more than a tactical victory. It was a moment when technology, human decision-making, and psychology converged to redefine the battlefield. Shermans moving through misty jungle trails were not merely armored vehicles. They became symbols of inevitability, instruments that reshaped both terrain and morale. For the Japanese officers and soldiers who faced them, the encounter was a brutal lesson in the limits of doctrine, courage, and preparation when confronted with overwhelming mechanized force. War, in its most immediate sense, is about survival, control, and the exertion of power. Yet in moments like this, it also reveals the fragile boundaries between fear and courage, between anticipation and chaos. The jungle, once a natural ally to defenders, became a stage for calculated mobility and precision. The human mind, tasked with interpreting what it cannot control, confronted the disorienting reality of machines operating with speed, armor, and lethal intent. Leadership was tested not just in directing troops, but in managing uncertainty, fear, and the collapse of expectation. From the American perspective, The engagement demonstrated the profound impact of preparation, coordination, and integrated tactics. The Shermans were not invincible, nor were the victories inevitable, but meticulous planning, reconnaissance, and combined arms execution magnified their effect, turning technological advantage into operational dominance. The lessons extended beyond this island. Pre-dawn assaults, armored mobility, and psychological leverage became principles repeated across the Pacific campaigns, shaping the trajectory of the war. Yet, beyond strategy and casualty reports, the engagement resonates on a human level. Fear, confusion, and awe-shaped actions as much as orders and training. Soldiers, officers, and civilians alike experienced the intersection of human endurance and mechanical force. A reminder that history is lived in moments of tension, uncertainty, and moral consequence. The Sherman's advance before dawn was not only a story of steel and firepower. It was a story of human response to the unknown, a testament to the interplay of technology, courage, and fear in shaping the outcome of conflict. In the end, the battle stands as a vivid illustration of war's dual nature, both physical and psychological. It reminds us that in warfare, as in life, the line between preparation and chaos is narrow, and that the convergence of planning, innovation, and human resilience determines not only who holds the ground, but who holds the will to endure. The pre-dawn Shermans did more than move across the jungle. They shifted the course of engagement, leaving a lasting imprint on those who faced them and those who would study their advance for generations to come.